the record button. Welcome, everybody. This is Heather Riggs from the New England Museum Association. I'm here in Somerville, Massachusetts, and our NEMA offices are in Arlington, just across the border there. I want to welcome you to our response to the pandemic, how library archives shifted to virtual and remote services. I'm sure you're all here because you're in a library or archive or have interest in both of those. I'd like to welcome Jeffrey Henry. He's our PAG Chair for the Library and Archives PAG, and he's also works at the Reuben Hoar Library. And I would also like to welcome Kim Toney from the American Antiquarian Society. Jeffrey, this is your show today, so I'm going to pass it along to you.
No pressure at all.
No, none. You'll be fine.
So yeah, here I'm coming to you live from Westford, Mass. You know, the lighting's fairly good today, so it's not too bad in this camera, but as we all know, these Zoom meetings are fun like that. So, you know, I may be from Westford, Mass, but I work over in Littleton next door at the Reuben Hoar Library. And of course, into February 2020, our yearly foot traffic was around 55,000 patrons. Book circulation, around 180,000 items, such as books, DVDs, ebooks, all the usual things you can find at your local public library. We are part of the MVLC Interlibrary Loan System, as well as the statewide Commonwealth Catalog. Most of our local history collection was available to browse in person by appointment, actually. But you know, the area was often utilized on request in practice. Of course, our regular archives were actually in storage and only accessible by staff. And then, of course, in March, all heritage institutions, all shapes and sizes, suddenly were hit by the pandemic like everyone else, causing dramatic changes everywhere. And let me bring up my my images here, which I, of course, neglected to put up right away, but that's all right. Take 1 second here. You'd think I'd be adapted by now. And there's an image of our front door. Hasn't changed much over the years. It's that has been one of our programs, one of many that hasn't really been functioning that much face to face. Now, of course, our present building is small and compact. We're actually in the same building as the Littleton Town Hall right now. And we have overall square footage, about 16,000 square feet across 3 floors. Stacks roughly take up about half the space. And if you've ever been to a public library, we have most of our stuff out on the floor for you to look at on a, you know, what used to be a normal reality. And of course, that overall, but of course, when it comes to overall space, I'm not counting meeting rooms, which can be a little more spacious. And of course, because we're smaller, that's why we're having a new building being built right now for us. That's a lot more open, probably along lines, if you've ever been in the Chelmsford Public Library, a little more, have that open feel that's a little less of a bottleneck in some ways that we've never really paid that much attention to until recently. And of course, because we're having a new building available, that's why so many of these statistics are available to me, which is convenient in that way. But then, of course, by March 13, all the town buildings closed to the public, including the library. So, but you know, unlike many libraries in March, we did decide to experiment with curbside pickup to avoid in-person, at least try to avoid person-to-person contact, and of course canceled every in-person program, including library fundraisers and book fairs. So we can't take any book donations anymore because our storage is full. Patrons still randomly donate books anyway, and we have a tendency not to say no to that when they just appear. Unfortunately. Before briefly closing entirely during the early on, internal operations largely continued, like the purchasing of new items for general circulation. And, you know, we're not a big staff, so it wasn't too big a deal at that point. Only 2 people work in the back room, and they've been keeping themselves quite separate even today. Now, based on state guidelines, we were later ultimately able to accept returns, and the entire system was adapted. So basically, there were nothing late. Everything kept getting renewed over and over again. So that was convenient for people who just couldn't drop them off to closed libraries anyway. But according to state recommendations from the library board of the state, you could about 48 hours is the recommended quarantine time for any returned items. And to keep things simple, anything that comes in through the interlibrary loan service is kept that way, is kept for 2 days as well, because we just don't really know how they're exactly doing it. But as a separate example, the Fletcher Library in Westford quarantines for up to 7 days, just to show that there is some variety in how we're all sort of adapting to this. And of course, there's continued use of continued bathing in hand sanitizer, wrapping in face masks, and social distancing, and as of course should go without saying. Now, one of the main things that we've been doing all along, or doing now, of course, like what we're doing right now, are remote and virtual services. Uh, we were not wholly without already available solutions along those lines. Holds on books were possible to do via the online catalog for decades, as the online catalog could be used for browsing through keywords. That includes old-fashioned subject headings from Library of Congress. And now and sort of like always, there was phone, email, for essentially virtual and remote reference, and we also now have online forms for readers advisory, and especially young parents, they go quite overboard with large stacks of holds. We don't stop them, and we do it with a smile. Um, we have and we also have a large number of subscriptions to online databases, which turns out to be much more than average for for your local suburban public library. Our director once joked that he might have a problem when it comes to subscribing to all these online databases, and he actually had to rearrange the whole setup a year or two back to actually make it, searchable. Of course, the drawback of a lot of those subscriptions is that you need a library card number, and often that number is well, the number essentially is pinned to your local library, and so a lot of those subscriptions aren't really you can't really do them at home. And as you know, I'm a Westford resident, so in a lot of ways I can't really access Littleton's many databases, and Westford actually has a lot less databases. So that can be an awkward thing, especially when we're not really letting a lot of people in the building to use computers in person at the moment. Um, now, that said, we're part of the larger MVLC system, so it doesn't matter as much when it comes to interlibrary loans. Now that they're functioning again, it was shut down over the summer. I think it's Optima is our delivery service, and they figured out how to make it work. And our delivery guy is the mask glued on his face, so that's okay. Now, even before then, it was possible to place holds at individual libraries if you were savvy, because I'm technically a Westford patron, but I can take books out from Chelmsford and Littleton, and that can be done. But MVLC is a fairly broad system, and we're sort of at the most westerly end of it, so it can be convenient to go to the other side for just that one book you really want to read. But it did sort of feel worth it at the time. But of course, the delivery service resumed, and that's kind of working. Now, for a lot of other remote services proved definitely a lot less restrictive in many senses. If the patron assuming the patron had access to the internet. So many programs switched to Zoom. Surprise, including many of our book clubs. One I had run, I had essentially done differently, just did it through Facebook Live and just sort of talked for a little while, and that seemed to work, and that was good enough for the time. And that's what we're still doing today for many, especially the children's room programs. They're just posting videos online, similar to what's going to happen with this video at some point. So we actually, so that means we began to rely heavily on social media, much more so than we ever had. So and that has its advantages. It's free, and you just have to ignore some of the other issues social media can have. Everyone likes to have their own opinion up there. You mentioned you're going to do a program with H.P. Lovecraft, and they're like, oh yeah, wasn't that guy kind of racist? Well, yes, I was going to talk about that, but so you get these weird issues, get these unique issues, but in Lovecraft, by the way, was actually surprisingly complicated if you dive into it, but that's neither here nor there. Um, so and so because of that, that has kept us connected with the public as best as was possible. As a public library, we are mandated to serve the public. And that has been made incredibly difficult because of the pandemic, because you want the patron to come back, you want the visitor to return, and if they get sick, they might not, so it becomes, it's almost contradictory on how we've been doing. But what we've been doing has been good enough. Our patrons are very forgiving, and we're pretty sure they're smiling under the mask when we give them their when we hand over their books and DVDs, which is good because it can be a little stressful. Now, of course, like I said, we have to serve the public. We were asked, like, when can we come in to browse again? Where they're not like forcing it, but they're curious. And so, but especially some months back, I swear every time we started talking about that, suddenly the numbers spiked. So it kept getting pushed back. And again, we're kind of small and cramped. But especially since the last spike, we've been allowing, especially since everything calmed down again, we've been allowing people back in the building with reservations, which is really, in some ways, the only way to do it. And you got to reserve, like, it turns out to be 15 hours in advance. And we might let you in if you're late, but you still got to leave exactly when your reservation ends. So we're at least strict in that sense. And of course, sanitizer, mask, and all that. And my boss will have no qualms about kicking you out if she sees the mask down. I'll tell you, she's direct. And other things we've been doing since we've been back in the building since late summer is, at least I sort of basically digitized my old book display I've been doing, and just literally just a picture, of the old-fashioned book display. And strangely, it wasn't intentional, but many of the planned ones had somewhat of a morose sense to it, talking about, Dr. Frankenstein and stuff. So it's like, that was not intentional, but it, seems to work. And, you can put holds on any of these books. These are as the books you're seeing, those are right there. And for fun, I threw a QR code in there for related virtual program that literally works right now. So that's so there are a lot of virtual and digital things that are out there that help out a lot to keep everybody safe in this wild universe we now live in. So, and that's and I, of course, that's posted over on Facebook. I think I'm actually a few days late on that, and I gotta, when I'm in tomorrow, I'll be doing that. So now, while the socially distant services proved successful, or at least the best that could be done, a lingering issue was and is the archive and special collection. In some ways, why we're all here. No plans were directly applied to it, while the once reservable room, again, is just too small to be safe for public use at the moment. When I'm in there, I'm the only one in there. And it's also a little stuffy in there, but it's neither here nor there. The unofficial guidelines right now are to simply provide remote reference, like everything else, and be ready to take a picture or scan when required. The cell phones are as good or better as any scanner now. So there's, so that's helpful. The silver lining is that we are able to conduct the necessary inventory of our collections uh, for our rapidly approaching move to the new building, which is pretty much just on the other side of the parking lot, but it's still a move. And because of there's far less interruptions, so that's kind of an awkwardly nice thing, to be able to do something without any issue along those lines. Um, so and also makes it much quicker to rectify any issues, which any older collection, as we all know, will have many issues over time. How are we operating today? The pandemic, of course, is still ongoing, and the continued fluid nature of this era still arguably leads to dramatic changes that is now part of the course. It seemed that every time we discussed opening for a limited number of patrons, as I mentioned, those numbers spiked. It's very hard to predict how we're going to do things, even next week at times. Now, because we were allowed, because things have improved, we have a lot of things have relaxed. We have those screening forms when they come in, and like I said, well, my boss will kick you right out if you're breaking any of the rules. And all those curbside and virtual services do continue. And they've been working. But like I said, some patrons love to make a lot of holds. So, I always like to say when they show up, it's going to be a few minutes, and that's usually about right. Uh, so, so questions on future operation cannot be easily answered in the moment. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm cautiously optimistic that the fall 2021 will be almost feeling like normal, but like I said, cautiously optimistic. However, our greatly expanded reliance on social media, Zoom, and other remote services is an experience that we can certainly take with us in the years ahead. So there can be some positive to this, I would hope. And well, there's my little babble. And now I'd like to shift the attention to Kim Toney of the unique American Antiquarian Society.
Hi, everyone. As Jeff said, I'm Kim. I am head of reader services at the American Antiquarian Society. I'm going to offer, I guess, a bit of a different perspective as someone who works at a private research library. We are free and open to the public, but we sort of function a little differently. Although, of course, listening to Jeff just now, there's a lot of stuff that I think definitely relates. And I'm excited to see from people introducing themselves in the chat, excited to see and hopefully get to know and hear from colleagues at public libraries. So I'm also going to share my screen here. Let me see. Oops. Okay, so just to give a little bit of background about the AAS, as I said, we're a private research library. We're located in Worcester, Massachusetts, and our mission is to collect, preserve, and make available one copy of everything, anything printed in British North America, in most cases before 1876, and in some cases up through 1900 or so. And to that end, we have, I think the number is about 4 million items in our collection. So there's quite a lot of stuff here, and it all is on site. As I said, we're free and open to the public, although the majority of people who use the library on a daily basis are people who are on fellowship. So we have a very active fellowship program where people apply for funding to support research, to come research early American history in our collection. And they will stay for a month up to a year at a time, and we have housing for them on campus. And you can imagine how that the pandemic really complicated the fellowship model that we follow at AAS. But we do welcome all kinds of researchers here, We say as long as our collections can support your research, you're welcome to come. So we see a lot of historians, local professors, people interested in early American history, genealogists, all that sort of thing. We have a large collection, but we for 30, 40 years now have really prioritized trying to scan a lot of our collection and create digital surrogates, because we do not allow anything in our collection to circulate outside of the building. What COVID really problematized again for us was the fact that by the time people understand that they need to look at things in the AAS's collection, they need to be seeing those things in person, because they've sort of exhausted digital or virtual resources. So really, our collection for a long time now has been sort of, it's been important for people to look at the material firsthand, so to deal with the primary materials, not only to experience them by reading what's in between the pages of books and pamphlets and magazines and newspapers and things we collect, but also to think about books as objects, to look at bindings, to think about paper quality, paper marbling, book arts, things like that. So it was definitely an upheaval. I think AAS has been around since 1812. Historical institutions, libraries and archives like ours, I know we're not maybe necessarily thought of as being on the cutting edge of virtual programs all the time. AAS certainly, we were sort of moving in that direction. We had just completed a construction project in end of 2019, 2020. We were getting ready to use these new spaces in our library, and obviously that really didn't get off the ground for a while for us. Anyway, so I was looking through photos to just add to this presentation. I do feel like we're all maybe dealing with some Zoom fatigue at this time, so I thought photos would be nice to look at. And I was sort of lamenting the fact that we haven't had this many people in our reading room in a very long time. But here's a little picture of our reading room. And I just want to talk about kind of what happened and how we shifted to this virtual life that we've all been living collectively. So it was, I think, March 17th when we all got the email that we would be working from home for what everyone thought would be a very temporary basis. And I think we hung around for a couple of weeks and sort of, canceled all the things that we had on deck for the next couple of weeks. And then when we started to realize that this thing was going to go on for a long time, we really had to come back together virtually and think about how we were going to remain relevant and also offer research assistance for people, because as I said, when people are relying on fellowships to finish books, to do research, and their book deadlines aren't changing, and all of a sudden the archive they need to use to see the one copy of whatever their argument is hinging on, it can be really difficult. So we have to think of ways to help those people and also just remain relevant in like I guess an environment that maybe can be foreign to some of us. I'll speak for myself as librarians. So what we did pretty early on was we negotiated with some of the contractors who work to scan materials for us. As I said, we've been scanning things in our collection for a long time in order to make digital surrogates available. And it's also a big way that we preserve materials, right? Because when you have a surrogate, you don't have to pull it off the shelf to have someone look at it easily. And much of the material that we've scanned is only available through like pay for use or subscription only databases that people have to use when they're on site with us. So we negotiated with our scanning companies, our publishing companies like Redex, Newsbank, many I'm sure you're familiar with, EBSCO and Gale, Cengage, IDI, to allow people who have been granted fellowships with us access remotely. So this did not translate to members of the general public. Unfortunately, we really have closed our doors and we're not open to the public and haven't been since we shut down on March 17th. But we've tried to facilitate access for fellows in particular. So those remote fellowships, or I guess we've created a model called a remote fellowship, where people who are granted fellowships but who cannot come are able to access subscription-only databases remotely. And also to meet their needs, we have this sort of virtual reference model where I will meet one-on-one with fellows to talk them through what we can do for them remotely. In the early stages, I was at home too, so I couldn't access the collection either, but I could get to other databases and things that they could not. So we were kind of furiously downloading PDFs as we needed to get information to people. And we'd also have like virtual cataloging info sessions with fellows to talk them through how to best use our catalog, which has its own set of sort of idiosyncrasies inherent in it. So again, just sort of reaching out in these virtual Zoom ways that we could to make ourselves available as much as possible to fellows who are really our core constituency in a lot of ways. We also, so I guess through March and again through the summer, we kind of lived in this virtual world where we were doing one-on-one info sessions, but we also, I guess, increased the amount of work that we might do for people who we call readers, who are not on fellowship, but members of the general public, we call readers, who have reference questions that we might in the before times not spend as much time on because we didn't have the bandwidth, because we're juggling all the other in-person stuff. So we had certain members of the reference staff act more as like research assistants and spend more one-on-one time with people who had like really particular questions. We had someone who needed some help keyword searching through some newspaper issues for things like, I don't know, particular news stories and things like that. So we were spending more time, within reason, spending more time than we might normally, because we weren't necessarily juggling all the in-person asks and dealing with all the people. And I would say, in contrast to the numbers of people that those of you who work at public libraries might see in the day, this image of the reading room you're seeing is kind of typical for like what we would call a busy day. But there's still a lot of policies in place, as you know, when you're dealing with rare books and materials that you have to adhere to in terms of, actually I heard Jeff say hand sanitizer, and hand sanitizer is like a very big no-no at AAS, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But there are a lot of security protocols and things. So when you're out of the building, there's, I guess, more bandwidth to maybe try to facilitate research for people remotely. And we also made a big shift toward virtual programming. As I said, we had just finished construction on this new, what we're calling the Learning Lab. And the intent was to use this lab as sort of the center for virtual programming anyway. We just were really, we had to sprint towards the finish line, getting that up and running when the pandemic hit, because we were kind of, you know, we weren't quite there yet. So, but we did start running webinars and seminars. We created like a monthly book talk program to sort of engage former fellows and members of AAS with an academic audience, mostly for those book talks. So again, as a way to like invite the public in, even though they couldn't come, and participate in public programming that we usually do in person in that larger reading room that you just saw. And again, we facilitated public programs that were now virtual, on all kinds of things. This is a public program, a virtual program on manuscripts with our curator of manuscripts. I did one on, I helped out with one on Indigenous foodways last year. And then these long distance initiatives are sort of class visits where classes who are long distance can sort of beam in. I sort of neglected to mention at the beginning, but AAS, beyond being a library and an archive, is a learner society in that we do a lot of this public programming. And we also have a steady stream of classes, whether that's K through 12 programming or undergraduate and graduate class visits that come through every year. We've built really strong connections with especially like teachers, professors in the area who still wanted to figure out a way to use AAS collections materials, even though we were not letting anyone in the door. So by, I guess, late June, early July, staff started coming back on site, and we decided that we would allow fellows, people who had received fellowships, to come back and use the library. So though we weren't open to the public at that time, we began opening our doors to fellows who would stay for 4 to 6 weeks, and then a new one would come through, and we were welcoming 4 or 5 at a time. And we've been open to fellows in that sort of way with some changes since that time in July. But yeah, so, and although we weren't letting professors in, we were doing these long distance sort of learning initiatives with people too. And we have like a little document camera that proved really useful as a way to show collections while we were talking to people. We sort of had to, you know, rig up a TV and microphones, and we've used all manner of different laptops and things to facilitate this virtual programming that we had to switch to. And by September 7th, so sorry, this is my slide on the July reopen. September 7th, we aimed to sort of ratchet up getting more staff back on site. Through July to September was like the date for getting people on site. So we had staff come together, mostly department heads, who created working documents about how we would implement COVID procedures across different departments in the library, especially in the reading room, where we would have outside people, these fellows who are essentially members of the public, coming in. You know, the people on this team were responsible for figuring out what was the alternative to hand sanitizer, since we're not allowing that with our special collections. What's the like attestation or the I don't have COVID form that people will sign when they come in? How much does it cost to purchase sneeze guards and alcohol wipes, and all that kind of stuff. So there are people tasked with that, and we actually regularly review this documentation in the Reader Services Department every month or so as things change in our state. We allowed fellows on site. We also managed collection quarantine times. As Jeff mentioned, some people use a 2-day quarantine, some as long as 7 days. Our default is 3 days, although we might leave things on a cart or you know, for a week before it gets returned. But across departments, we try to stay on top of that. And as I said, we reassessed in September. And at that time, we kind of had decided that based on, you know, staff bandwidth, also trying to be mindful of the collective trauma that we're all experiencing in this pandemic and the, you know, social justice movements and things, that instead of being open 5 days a week to a sort of revolving door, a monthly revolving door of fellows, we switched to having the library open 3 days per week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then we had more time on Tuesdays and Thursdays to focus on more of this virtual stuff, right? Because we were so occupied being open 5 days a week before that it was harder for us to find time to have these one-on-ones or to offer Zoom research sessions with people, or to be super helpful with the programs committee or something, doing things with them. So yeah, we reassessed in September. Let me see. When we switched to opening 3 days a week, we also switched to only allowing fellows who were on long-term appointments, who had received long-term awards. That meant instead of having new people trickle in every month, we only had people who had research support for 4 months to 6 months to up to a year at a time. This was also helpful in managing book quarantines, because typically people on short-term fellowships want to look through a lot of material because they only have a short period of time to do that. But long-term fellows, they can be, I guess, more leisurely in their work and are really focused on writing when they're in the reading room. So it really helped in terms of, again, as I said, being mindful of like staff, like I'm always thinking about sort of like, is everyone handling this okay? Like maybe we don't need to be open 5 days a week, and 3 days would be better for us as we're all sort of navigating this time and wearing masks constantly in the reading room. and things like that. So yeah, it also, I guess, just cut down on the masses of books in quarantine we were accumulating over time, and our need to get them, you know, back into the stacks. Let's see. We also have a, I guess I call it an inventory or a collections tracking system called Aeon. I don't know if any of you all use this system, but that was really helpful in helping us to track materials, whether they were being used in the reading room or being used for virtual programming or class visits, things like that. So anytime a book is removed from the stacks and brought anywhere else in the building, we tell this computer system called Aeon so we can track where it is and where it's going. So we can look at that and know when was the last time it was touched. Is it okay to bring that back or things like that. And one really good thing I think that has come out of this quarantine is that staff buy-in and staff use of that computer system has like really gone up. Like the learning curve is a little less of a curve now. So that's really great because that people's ability to use this computer system really affects circulation in the library and our work at Reader Services. Yeah, so we've just been kind of going like this for some time now, as I said, since June, and then sort of reassessing in September and going along. We are thinking more about what will change in the future, especially as things are changing in Massachusetts in a strange way. So places are being allowed to open more fully, but also people are getting vaccines. So we're thinking about reassessing again for May, when we will allow a larger group of fellows. Again, we have to think about where they're going to be sitting, how we can space them out, even though we have a pretty large room to deal with. But, you know, and quarantining not only books, but people, if people are traveling from out of state and things like that. And we will probably reopen 5 days a week at that point. But the idea of reopening to the general public is still pretty far off in our minds, just because that would be more, I guess, people to deal with. As I mentioned, we have other houses on campus where fellows stay. And I think it's easier for us to think about having fellows staying on campus and sort of close by where they're not, you know, coming to Worcester from Connecticut or something and dealing with maybe quarantine issues that you might otherwise have to deal with if you weren't living on campus with us. But when we do turn to opening to a general public, we've talked about having appointment scheduling, which will work for us in the way that we don't see too many people from outside, but I think appointment scheduling is something that will work really well for us, and hopefully something that we will keep beyond the pandemic. When I think about what's next too, I think about what we might continue to do beyond the pandemic. Certainly this ratcheting up of virtual visits and virtual seminars and webinars and things, I think is probably something we're all going to continue doing, although I will speak for AAS, and having a small staff, we'll definitely have to reassess what do we have to compromise on in order to continue to be a virtual presence and continue to have these virtual seminars and things, while we're all still trying to get back to the in-person, one-to-one, face-to-face work that we're needing to do. But also this idea of we orient people to the library, we tell them sort of the rules of the building, and how to interact with special collections. I've been doing that virtually, which is really convenient and easy. And these virtual cataloging sessions to talk fellows through how to find materials they're looking for in our catalog. That seems really like something we might want to continue to do beyond the pandemic, if this ever ends, in the ways that you can screen share, and have like a shared experience in ways that, like in person, it's kind of hard when you're leaning over somebody's computer to see what's on their screen or something like that. And then also this remote fellowship option. I think this push toward increasing access to materials by getting companies who have subscription-only databases to be a little more helpful in terms of allowing access to people who are off-site would be a really great thing to keep and continue on with. A really great model for people not only from faraway states who can't necessarily get to AAS, but who really would benefit from looking at our materials, but people from other countries who, for whatever reason, cannot make it to AAS. I think these remote models that we've worked out with publishing companies, it would be really great to try to continue those relationships as we go forward. So yeah, I guess that's about all I have to say. I kind of want to wrap it up because I'd love to hear questions and hear from others of you, but we've kind of been, as I say, at AAS going along and really starting to think about the ways that this pandemic, but also, you know, civil unrest has caused us to rethink how we do things and how we present ourselves in the world and how we engage people. And has also really encouraged me to think about how we facilitate access virtually and in person, and how we can better facilitate access virtually and in person. Thanks.
Kim, thank you for that. I do appreciate that you're actually thinking of the staff.
I'm sorry.
When you were talking on that one, I mean, that's something that I think all of us are functioning with, of how do we deal with the staff, with the public, everything that's gone on in the last year. It's a lot. So I do appreciate that one on that. And it's interesting to see how you guys are moving more into the virtual realm, especially with, you know, your virtual visits and stuff like that. So I know we do have a lot of people from the Mary Baker Eddy Library. I'm just kind of curious to see if anybody on this call is currently allowing people in their archives, or are they holding off? Have they started digitalizing and stuff like that? So you can either unmute yourself or put yourself in the chat. Dorothy, go for it.
I can talk about that a little. Hi guys, I'm Dorothy Rivera. I'm the manager of research and reference services at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. So the research room is kind of my place. We are not currently open to the public. Our understanding right now is that staff will probably not be back on site in a real, like, mandatory, consistent way until potentially September. That being said, we have a decent portion of our collection already digitized. Our Mary Baker Eddy collection is digitized. Our reminiscence collection is digitized. So we've been able to help out a lot of people, like Longyear Museum. We've been able to provide them with a good amount of material that's been supporting talks that they've been doing. We've been able to support some of their articles. We're also still doing a lot of articles ourselves, writing things. I guess one thing I'd be interested to hear what Kim is doing is we have suspended our fellowship program for the upcoming year, partly because we still need to accommodate people from last year. And we have a substantially smaller research space than you do. We've talked a little bit about being able to bring people up into the research room, and it sort of fell apart under the weight of its own stupidity when I tried to sort of logic through getting people papers, walking back 6 feet across the line, back and forth. But I'm interested in that virtual fellowship program you mentioned. How, because whenever I bring up stuff like that, people get very nervous about copyright and proprietary things, and it makes them very uncomfortable. How did you go about convincing people to let you do this?
Well, that's kind of at AAS, we fall back on the sort of lucky us that we have primary materials before 1876 that are not under copyright. So we luckily don't deal with a lot of copyright issues. But and we also have suspended our short-term fellowship program for next year in order to deal with not having a logjam of people. But yeah, I think there is a general movement in academia to get things outside of these like proprietary databases. And I really, speaking for myself, think it's in the best interest of these companies to be more willing to share and allow remote access to this stuff. But I am not the person who negotiated those contracts or dealt with that. I think part of the issue too is that we were able to say like, oh, it's only going to be 1 or 2 people for like 4 weeks at a time, you know? So I think just presenting it to these companies in a way that seems like not sort of biting at their bottom line. And also that we've had like a 40-50 year relationship with Redex. So we have a lot of back and forth with them all the time. But I will say that I don't think it was an easy ask. It took several weeks and a lot of conversation too, but it's really something that I think is really great, and people like being able to do the remote research that way and have access.
Yeah, because I think I actually, the library is part of the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium as well. And we actually have a meeting coming up this week to discuss what they're going to do for accommodating fellows for the upcoming year and which places can and which places can't. And one thing I noticed for our last meeting was there'd be places in Maine, Vermont, and they're like, oh yeah, we're open a couple days a week to the public, come on down. And then there are people in Boston who are like, no, just sort of diving behind the nearest piece of furniture.
For sure, yeah. It's amazing the range of experiences that people are having.
Yeah, it's always interesting to know. My friend out in Idaho is going to the library, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not going in any buildings right now. So I know in the last year, there's also been a lot of granting opportunities for the digitalization. I'm just kind of curious to see if anybody here has actually had any luck with getting any of those grants, because I know that was a quick shift for like NEH, IMLS, and a bunch of other places that suddenly had money available for those things, which I thought was great.
Here at the Joshua Hyde Public Library, we are in the process of trying to get a grant for our local history collection to try and organize and get more materials, because we are in the process of doing a shelf read, digitizing things for our 125th anniversary.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to see where that goes.
Good luck.
Jessica can speak more about that because I'm just the lowly intern. She's the charge of the project. So if you want to go ahead, Jessie, go ahead.
Hi, we did not pursue any of the COVID CARES Act funding for the library other than what came through our municipal distributions. So we weren't looking at any of those larger initiatives. This is actually pursuing a Go Local grant through the Mass Board of Library Commissioners LSTA funds redistribution for this fiscal year, or the 2022 fiscal year. But I am familiar with down in Connecticut, there was they put in for either the NEH or the IMLS CARES Act funding, and I think they were awarded it, at least the second one, the IMLS one. That was a collaborative effort among a number of institutions working together. And I think, if I remember correctly, and anyone else on the call who may be familiar, when we looked back at NEH CARES distributions, I'm not sure that the Northeast was as well represented as some of the Midwest and other areas of the country. And I'm not sure if that was just sort of a personality thing for us, or where that went. But in terms of CARES Act, distribution regionally was down compared to other regions of the country. However, LSTA funding is still going forward, as are the NHPRC and other grant programs. So right now, I think we just continue on, and that's really sort of my level of familiarity at the moment.
More than mine. So I do have the other question, because Kim mentioned moving forward that they are rethinking of how they go about things in the future. I was just wondering if anybody has started that thought process of maybe changing their structure of making more appointments. Is the access going to be the same? I mean, granted, we don't have that magic ball of what's going to happen in the next several months, let alone several years. But, has anybody started thinking long-term range of maybe changing the way that we are currently structured or doing things? Dorothy, go for it.
Sure, and my immediate supervisor, Allison, is on this call, so she can talk about this a little as well, as I pitch you under the bus, Allison. it's been that kind of day. But I think it's one of those things that it sort of allows us to think about things a little differently and consider, not just, how do we appropriately serve our patrons? How do we look at how we're going to sort of administer things structurally? I think we've looked at, how many people need to be in the office. I think we talked a little bit about sort of having some value for our staff's mental and emotional well-being, which I think is undervalued in many places, but figuring out, how you can balance sort of having people in versus out of the office. I mean, people like seeing their families in the daylight, and that's something we want to be able to accommodate as much as we possibly can, but also looking at long-term things like digitization projects. One fun thing that people in archive world will understand is we're looking at when do we replace our Lieberts? Because we currently operate 3 fairly substantial ones. And there's a question of, well, could we operate on 2? If we manage to scale down the amount of collections on site, maybe we could operate on 2. Okay, that's a big digitization project. And you see it kind of starts running after itself pretty quickly from there. But Allison has more on that.
Well, I mean, in general, we're moving more and more towards the notion that we really do have to have a major digitization effort, not just because of the idea that, maybe we shrink the size of our stacks, but also just what we've really learned from the pandemic is just how much we can serve people if more things are digitized, because we've always had a remote reference service. We get people calling in with questions and writing in with questions, and that's been a normal part of our library's life forever since it was founded. But what we're discovering is just how much of what we provide to people can be done remotely. And we'll be able to do even more if we continue to digitize. Plus, there's also, as Kim was talking about, the preservation aspect. There are some things that even if you come on site, we don't want you touching it. So yeah, but the more we can do remotely, the more that means the research staff doesn't necessarily have to be on site in a research room serving the public. We can do that from home just as well. So we are talking about what the future looks like in terms of staffing, and probably everyone will be working some portion of their weeks remotely, even after the pandemic is over.
And I think one thing, before I was with the library, I was also at National Archives over in Waltham. And one thing that I know you guys probably all have a lot of experience with is we're trying to teach Amanda Fish here a lot of the time. We're trying to help develop that skill set. And one thing that we found with our patron base, because we have a lot of church members, we have a lot of people from a variety of different backgrounds. Our patron base does not really look like Kim's patron base a lot of the time. Kim's patron base is very vested in sort of working with original documents. So one of the things that we're able to do through this, we also have a papers project for the library. By digitizing more materials, we can do things like, well, here's some of the material that relates to your question, and here are some original documents you might want to look at. You've asked about when Mary Baker Eddy wrote this particular poem. Well, here is our annotated chronology of Mary Baker Eddy's life. We're sort of trying to empower our patron base so that they can be more engaged, can understand more about the collections, and that kind of generates greater interest overall. So that's another, I think, real value to digitization, is we're not just answering their questions, we're providing them with the resources to sort of understand the answers. And that's, I think, a real nice kind of pleasant side effect of digitization.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing. Does anybody have any questions? We're coming up at our hour mark, but figured I'd throw it out there. There's a lot of all right. Well, I think we'll end a little early then. Jeffrey, thank you for setting this up and sharing your information. And Kim, thank you for sharing what AAS is doing. It's always great to hear what people are doing out in the field. And I do appreciate the people from Mary Baker Library letting me call on them because you guys are here. So I just want to thank you, and we will see you at a future event. I should mention that if you ever miss one of our workshops or webinars, the recordings are available on the NEMA website. Definitely check out our upcoming calendar. We have a lot of great things. If you have any suggestions for future webinars or town halls, definitely give us an email or a shout out. That would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, everybody.